Some years ago, INSEAD undertook a research project in Europe to find out what it is that makes a good chairman of a listed company board in Europe. And the results were published in the Harvard Business Review, and I was so impressed with the results and the stuff that I read as a result of it. I went to Nick Bernadelle, who was then Dean of GIBS, and said to him, we have to do the same thing here. We have to launch a research project, which with various organizational arrangements we started. And that whole process of interviewing a smaller sample than they did in Europe, but still 30 chairmen of listed company boards, was started and finished probably about 6 months ago. And the write-up of the results exists now in a white paper, which will be distributed shortly, and you'll each get a copy of it. So what I'm giving you, why I'm giving you the background, is to illustrate again our commitment to an investigation of what it is the chairman must do, what his challenges are, what the pressing issues are, and to use this information in the same way that a movie producer uses a movie to spread it around audiences and to let it do its job. One of the key subjects that came out of our study of the South African chairman, and it is that of independence. And we have found that many boards suffer from the difficulties generated by that simple concept of independence. One of the reasons for it is, I think, that people either don't understand it fully or don't agree with it, even if they do understand it. And I wondered what your comments might be, Roy, if we say, is independence a pressing issue for boards into the future, or what?
Thanks, Johan. I'm going to answer this slightly differently from what I think you possibly expected, because clearly I believe independence is absolutely vital. Let me say, I don't think that time on the board necessarily determines independence.
Yeah.
We've all seen directors who are fiercely independent after 9 years, and some who weren't independent before they started or didn't, who lost their independence along the route. So it's not a function of time, it's a function of mindset. But let me tell you why I think it's important. The chairman and the board are supposed to set the ethical tone. Now, I'll expand on that a little bit more, but if you are not independent, you don't have a sound foundation for setting the ethical tone. And this has become far more challenging, by the way, in this working from home type environment. I'm digressing a bit now into ethics, but you can do the physical things like the chairman can ensure that there's a code of conduct, code of ethics, disclosure of conflicts. But of course, if you're not independent, then how do you manage the process of disclosing conflicts? But the real challenge that's developing in South Africa now is if staff are working from home, management are working from home, people are joining the company who've never been to the company. They're actually joining working from home. How do you manage the ethics?
Yeah.
And how do you test the independence of mind? And, that's the old American phrase, you don't even have water cooler conversations anymore because the people just aren't there. So it is very, very challenging to monitor independence, but more importantly, I think, to monitor ethics in this current environment. And it's a conversation that I've had quite a lot with CEOs saying, what are you doing to ensure that the ethical culture is in this company? And how are you imparting, this is how we do things? So I'm probably very guilty of blurring independence and ethics, but I think they're so interlinked, you can't divide them.
The purpose of independence, as you say, is to operate without a conflict of interest and thus with integrity. And this is where it's a natural blurring with ethics. But the ultimate purpose, the goal of the board, is to to run to govern the organization for the interests of the stakeholders.
Mhm.
And I think that it is fair to say that there is a relationship, at the very least, between independence and knowledge of the intricacies of the business, and that the two are often that invariably one is favored, the independence, over what is really required to make good decisions. And therefore ethical decisions and good decisions go hand in hand. A good decision is both ethical and strategically sound. And so the very structure of the board there's an imbalance between the executive versus non-executive and independent directors, that when you look at and break it down, it also creates a dimension in terms of which, while there is representativity from on a multiple degree of dimensions, such as experience and demographic, etc., it also leads to a rather sort of a disjointed and dysfunctional activity in the boardroom, because there's very little that binds them together, as it were, besides the title director, non-executive or executive, but director of this particular company. They don't interact as a team outside of that. And so team dynamics is compromised, therefore team performance is compromised. And I think it's the role of the chair to be mindful of the challenges of these some of these rather these connected dynamics, to wade through what they're dealing with and forge a way forward to optimize their board performance. And this is
let's hear what the chairman say about that.
Yeah,
Gavin.
indeed.
Thank you very much. Rul, would you like to comment on independence and the issues that it creates in a board?
But I think in addition to the received wisdom and the articulated criteria for independence, such as length of service, which is questionable, such as whether or not you are a supplier of service or provider of service to the company, such as whether or not you are any one of your close kith and kin are actually suppliers of service to the company. The more significant thing for me was what Roy referred to as the attitude of mind. Objectively maintaining your independence, regardless of all of those other criteria, so over and above those other criteria. That for me is actually very, very important. But there are also certain subtleties. Not so long ago, I was invited to join the board of a major corporation, the international board, if you like. And I said, I'm afraid I am conflicted because you provide services in the following area, and that had something to do with insurance, lower down, and it has to do with funeral insurance. They said, I mean, at the level at which you will be operating, you will not be conflicted because you'll be dealing with international strategy. But that does not detract from the fact that if I was given an opportunity to refer something to either one of the company, which one would I refer it to? Whether I'm operating at group level or at operational or divisional level. So it's very much an attitude of mind that effectively say, I am not going to be compromised. I'll try to be as objective as can be, even where the subtleties might actually look not so damning. So the attitude of mind is key.
What would you do if there isn't an attitude of mind of independence?
Thanks, Johan, and greetings to colleagues. I think that the question of personal mindset is something very important. I fully subscribe to what fellow panelists have said about. I would add a small perspective to it, that for me, it's really about being that trusted and credible counselor. And so you have to take your own personal credibility seriously. as well, because that's where your currency of independence actually would come from. Because that source of credibility could be by virtue of experience, it could be by virtue of knowledge, but most critically, you craft it yourself over time based on the reliable, credible outsider perspective that you bring to bear on the strategic thrust of that organization. So I think that that sense of personal credibility becomes a key dimension that sharpens that independence.
My impression is, and I wonder if Gavin found this as well, but my impression is that sometimes independence is not understood by people on boards. This sounds crazy, but we often heard comments that board members behaved inappropriately simply through ignorance. I mean, that sounds terrible that members of a board of a listed company would not know how to be an independent board member, but it's true. And I'm sure you've experienced this.
Yeah, and building on that, you know, to contrive a formula for or rules for what constitutes independence invariably leads to one finding somebody who has little connection with the industry or economy, etc., and that's the only way they can be independent. Invariably, knowledgeable business people have, through their careers, had connections that leads to some form of connection and some
lack of
degree,
independence.
of independence. And so this notion of the requirement for independence, again, the thesis is that this has these unintended consequences of resulting in the appointment of people who are perhaps more distant than that which is optimal to the intricacies of the business, such that they are unable to provide deep, insightful input into what ought to be done by the business. And ultimately, that's the purpose of the board, is to make those fundamental decisions of importance to the business. And it's difficult to do that from a position so distant because you're independent.
If you're a person of integrity, when it comes to issues of independence, that integrity will serve as an internal locus of control that actually tells you what is objective, what is not objective, and whether or not you are in fact making pronouncements that bespeak lack of independence.
Or you have your hand up. Thank you, Roel. Yeah.
I was just saying, Johan, there are some extremes. I mean, I share with the view of my colleagues, historically, if you wanted to get onto the board of, say, Standard Bank or Nedbank, you would often be a major client. So if your major client of Standard Bank happened to be Toyota, the head of Toyota would serve on the Standard Bank board. But that's no longer the case. In fact, the Reserve Bank, the Prudential Authority, goes to an absolute extreme. I had the case where we put forward a potential director and for a bank that I was chairman of. And because he had investments through the wealth company, they said he was precluded because he wasn't independent, which is crazy. And they weren't material to the bank or to him either, by the way. But then you get the other extreme, which hits the headlines. And I don't want to get into specifics because I don't know the specifics. But let's see what's just recently happened at Old Mutual with the Peter Moyer situation. I don't want to debate that because it's not appropriate to do that here. But that just shows you how muddy the water can get. My own view is you should try and keep as much independence as possible, but don't rule out the skills you can get. Let me give you one last example, which has come to mind as I'm talking. On the board of Aspen Pharmacare is a representative of GSK, who used to be a shareholder. Now, he's actually a competitor in the world pharmaceutical market, but his ability to bring knowledge to the Aspen board is phenomenal. He knows more about the world pharmaceutical market than we in South Africa will ever know. So that's a conflicting one. So I guess the water is quite muddy on this subject.
The key thing here is that one can't quite be purist about independence, because it's the same way that you can't be purist about what constitutes conflict of interest. Because ultimately, the matter that tends to muddy the waters a little bit is the fact that any board of directors, as you've indicated already at the outset, Prof, is that has to constantly rise up to this barometer of, are you governing in the best interests of all stakeholders? And so within a board, you may then find that certain board members may be passionate about certain dimensions of stakeholder interest that may perhaps drive them to take certain positions different to others. And therefore, you may, as an individual, find that you have perhaps packaged, branded your own sense of personal credibility as best as you can.
Yes.
But perhaps from where they sit, depending on what lens they conduct their kind of worldview from, they may then look at you and say, you may deem yourself independent. We don't deem you independent. The other matter then is the good old shareholders, who may also have a different view on what constitutes independence.
Mm-hmm.
And to Roy's point, then it's also the regulator in this instance that believes that there's a certain model of what constitutes independence that they would like to see permeate in the financial sector and in the banking system. But the key thing is that ultimately, the key word is that key word of integrity. You need to be able to have your own scale that you hold yourself accountable to from a personal accountability point of view, and that sense of independent mindset. But ultimately, there's this coalescence of different worlds of view and interests that will ultimately shape what we eventually converge upon as the shared view. It becomes a shared view of what it means, whether 9 years, 12 years, 10 years makes you independent or less independent.
The independence issue has been very much in focus in state-owned enterprises, where there's been abuse of either funds or power. People who did not understand the need for independence simply took over and negotiated on behalf of the organization. I wonder what your experience has been in that regard, both of you.
Johan, I think it all boils down to what we have already spoken about, but then what compounds the issues where state-owned enterprises are concerned is that in a good number of cases, the appointment of the directors in the first place is based not on objective criteria such as we know as business people, as objective directors, as professionals. There is deployment.
Yeah.
In a good number of places, and deployment actually does not have any respect for professionalism. The people who are deployed are lackeys, they are cronies, they're actually praise singers to certain people in certain positions. So once you allow a person of that description or who comes in with those kinds of characteristics or character traits, you have already badly compromised the board. So first and foremost, the appointment of people to boards should take into account a number of objective criteria.
Okay.
Does not amongst them have deployment as a consideration at all. But having said that, any self-respecting company in appointing members of boards to the board should actually strive to do a thorough job, And if they've done a thorough job, you'll wind up with knowledgeable people. You'll wind up with people of integrity. And so in addition to what you might fancy, given your subjective integrity or in subjective locus of control, you will actually be working with peers who actually take it upon themselves to actually confront you.
Diversity and transformation are critical issues facing boards now. And the directive that I've lived with on a number of occasions is please find us a competent director, non-executive director, and please can it be a woman? and you know, one just simply has to respond to that. Knowledge of the business is less important than gender, say, or some of the other extraneous issues. I wonder what you would say, Roy, about the diversity and transformation in relation to some of the challenges.
I think, Johan, the answer is you have to balance the board. On any board, you need to have some key people with the key skills, such as accounting, auditing, legal, particularly IT. But there's room on a board for more diverse inputs, be they race, gender, and increasingly these days age, by the way. As you know, our children think differently from the way we think. So I've always said, let's build a board with the key skills that we know we have to have, not non-negotiables. Somebody to chair the audit committee, somebody to chair the IT committee. But the contribution that, say, females can make is extremely valid. And therefore, there's a room to balance it. Maybe the board lands up with one or two more people than you'd ideally like to have an efficient board. But I think it is manageable. And you know, when you know better than us, Johan, but when you search, you find some very talented people who might not have the specific experience you're looking for, but bring to bear a very interesting and an important viewpoint.
The challenge of chairman to ensure an inclusive board where all members' voice is heard, is respected, is integrated in a constructive manner, such that you have a cohesive, coherent, coordinated decision-making taking place at the board level. This is the challenge.
I just wanted to perhaps weigh in on both points. Firstly, on the SOC point that was raised earlier. I think it's absolutely important for any person accepting appointment as chairman of a board of an SOC to again leverage that sense of personal credibility that we spoke about, because you have to take your own moral authority seriously. And therefore, for me, at least day one, when you accept that appointment, you have to lay down certain principles that you are about and be clear what you won't do. And so that sense of laying the ground very clearly on where you stand on moral authority is important. In the ESCOM experience you cited, but also now in the forestry environment where I'm also chairing an SOC, what I found both to be both fulfilling is that you have to have a board that is strong enough to stand up to the powers that be, to, I guess, speak truth to power. But, you know, I can relate to many experiences of decisions from the time when we had Chairman Koza, Chairman Musa, Chairman Gotzel, and myself, where we had to say no to our shareholder as and when we felt whatever decisions we were asked to make would either not go well in terms of the best interest of the company, especially its balance sheet, its income statement. And at some instances, there was even very powerful presidents that we had to say no to because of the matter of principle.
Yeah.
That you're there entrusted to secure the best interest of an asset of state. So those principles have to carry whether you're in the private sector or public sector. On the matter of diversity, I think inclusion and diversity are essential requirements of our day-to-day. Every leader has to always move from the premise that, in the words of Manfred de Vries, we all have our own neuroses as leaders. In other words, you've got to know yourself and know that the worst thing I can do is to ensure that the NOMCO or the selection committee of the board secures leaders who think like I do, who behave like I do, who come from the similar background that I come from. And so as a chair of a board, you've got to go out of your way to make sure that you cultivate the requisite diversity around that table. It's the best thing you can do for yourself as a leader, but most importantly, is the best thing you can do for that organization. The role of the board is to set the tone at the top. So earlier on, we spoke about the ethics part of the tone at the top. The second part of the tone at the top is performance and corporate citizenship. So the average board has firstly, really primarily simple responsibility. Make sure that you set the tone, you set the strategic direction, and most importantly, that you've got an executive leadership that will execute and drive that performance. And therefore, you have one simple lever that in agreeing the performance contract goals of that chief executive and that CFO, that you ensure that all those thrusts that drive that various dimensions of corporate citizenship, which includes diversity and inclusion, which includes the whole question of operating as a contributor towards cultivating an inclusive society as a business. All those must form part of how you eventually evaluate your leaders at the end of the financial year. And so in the era we're in 2022, there's even more advanced ways of doing it. In the past, it used to be the so-called non-financial measures. We are well past that now, where you can quantify the price, the benefits and the cost of being a non-inclusive and non-diverse business.
The clashes that sometimes exist between the chief executive and the chairman, and you know, there have been departures from very high-profile chief executive jobs over the past couple of years that have cost the companies a fortune. Indeed. And I wonder what your comment is about how to maintain a productive relationship between the chairman and the chief executive, not a cozy one, but a productive one.
Indeed, this balanced relationship, yes, because and this certainly did emerge as one of the real challenges of a chairperson, is to empower the chief executive to be the chief executive, yet to not relinquish that sort of power and authority to the chief executive, such that the chief executive is capable of promoting an agenda and or a strategy that ultimately is either self-serving and or corrupt in some form, and can lead to terrible loss on the part of the organization. Yes, and this is a real tightrope that I think chair people have to walk, because there is this that the board itself is concerned with the governance of the organization, but is not concerned with the everyday running of the organization, and trying to find this area of where this meets and just what is their mandate is in and of itself up for debate, because ultimately the board whether the wording of our corporate governance is perhaps a little uncertain. Other codes of corporate governance speak about how the supervisory board is directly involved in decisions of fundamental importance. In other words, it really does get involved in the decision-making process as opposed to oversight of process.
But you get to the stage, and it's happened, I guess, to all of us in this panel, that you just have to say to the CEO, sorry, the board has lost confidence in you. I've only had to do it once. Not pleasant, particularly seeing as though I'd only been chairman for 5 or 6 years and the CEO did his whole career in the company.
Yeah.
But it had to do with ethics. It had to do with perceived corruption in the organization. And eventually you've got to have a meeting of the board and reach the conclusion that the CEO isn't the solution. But it's, as I say, I'm being blessed. It's only happened to me once in my career as the chairman. And I think I had to stand up and be counted. And I think the company's better off for it, despite the fact that that particular CEO is a very skilled individual.
You've got, as a chair, constantly ask yourself, how am I knowledgeable? And it's not really about being more technically knowledgeable than the CEO is, but it's about being knowledgeable constantly about the key drivers that are shaping, disrupting, changing that business. And most importantly, be the one that looks for, because it's like when you are coaching a team, they're right there in the middle of the game trying to defend a position. And your role as a chair is to constantly see what they don't see and constantly be the one that constructively points out the blind spots, and most importantly, help converge the board so that as a collective, you save the team from their own blind spots. And so that's very important if you want to add to the good points that have already been mentioned about the regular meetings and so forth. But most importantly, as a chair, you also have to have your own top of minds that you bring to bear in that discussion on a constant basis. Because therein, that's where you become that valuable outside-in counselor, that outside-in advisor. You've got to understand what it would take to grow the business, so that, again, you are able to see opportunities that the leadership don't see by virtue of constantly chasing numbers one quarter to another. There comes a point where they may miss certain important opportunities. So the other key thing is, in this era we live in of social media, as a chair of a board, you've got to have your own almost like dashboard where you use to comb through different platforms of social media to look for areas where the business may have a negative mention or a positive mention, so that to the extent that it may be missed, you are able to also raise that, because securing the reputation of the organization is critically important for the board to concern itself with.
Chairmen often feel the need to shine as such, and for them to be where the spotlight is in board meetings as such. And rather, they found that more effective chairmen play the role of conductor in a sense, and that their role is to get the most out of the team, not for them to be the source of the input, as it were. And that being said, that's not to say that they don't have that expert power, but it's a power that is latent. It's sort of under the surface, as it were. It's not explicit, it's implied through how they conduct the meetings, as it were. And a key descriptor of those meetings thus is impartiality. In other words, they're not trying to force their personal or their, when I say personal, their subjective, their agenda per se, but rather allow the team to collectively arrive at an optimal solution. Rule, I don't know if you want to. You're on mute there.
Who are you talking? Rule.
Rule. Yeah, he's just. There we go.
Correct. Given, I really agree with you that a chairman who is worth his salt will not be about shining, but a lot more about substance. And I would like to suggest that that substance, where just about chairing any company, starts with a sound understanding of the strategy. What is the company about in terms of its grand design? And they don't just move in and approve the strategy. They actually participate in the development and formation of the strategy. And then at the end, management will present their understanding and conceptualization of that strategy. And the board, led by the chair, will approve. But following that, I mean, it is also established by a number of surveys that many companies actually develop a strategy and then they write it down as something on paper. And when it comes to implementation during the course of the year, very, very little gets implemented. But if you have been involved in the development of the strategy and ultimately reflected on that strategy with a view to approving or disapproving, you will insist on the implementation of the strategy, not as somebody who wants to compete with the executives, but as somebody who wants to effectively monitor the implementation of that strategy. So my sense is substantial, and I've served under many well qualified, highly ethical, professional chairpersons, and learned quite a bit. And the majority of those that have done a good job are those that we have imbibed corporate governance deliberately and purposefully and made it a part of themselves, so much so that they don't have to actually prove anything to anybody. It becomes second nature.
The role of the chairman is to really act as the conductor behind the scenes and to make sure that he gets the best out of the board and that they provide the best opportunity to management to implement the strategy. That's the job. If you get that right, the company succeeds. And if your ego gets in the way, you're not serving the company.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
But it's a very interesting comment that Paul has made, the business of the conductor, having his back to the audience and his face to the orchestra. What is the role of the chairman compared to the role of the CEO in corporate communications? Because there was quite a lot of conflict about that in our feedback, wasn't there, Gavin?
Indeed. Yes. Yeah. And
I mean, my humble view is that the chairman has no business, making all manner of statements in corporate communications.
Yeah.
The face of the business is the CEO.
Yes.
The chairman is, if you like, an ambassador of the business that gets, I don't want to use the words deploy, but that gets deputized, let's perhaps say that, to go and engage key audiences and key events and key stakeholders as in an ambassadorial sort of business statesman role or statesperson role. But a chair that wants to have cameras flashing at them all the time, like has already been said, then is lost.
Not all of the time, but some of the time, maybe. I don't know, Roy, what do you think of that?
No. My default position is that the CEO is the face of the business. And it should only be in exceptional circumstances where it's absolutely appropriate for the chairman to fulfill that role. And of course, if it affects the CEO, if there's issues around the CEO, then the chairman has to adopt that position. But if it's routine matters, the CEO should the chairman should not seek the limelight, not at all.
The chairman should know his place as well, but the two need to have a complementary understanding. Chairman and chief executive who actually work together produce the kind of synergies that actually put the company in very good stead. So in big issues such as you are outlining, Johan, the chief executive will come with the technical knowledge, with the operational knowledge, and do a good job of that. And the chairman will step in to play, if you like, the business statesman role in complement, in a complementary fashion to the chief executive.
On the issue of strategy, and I'm referring to something that you said, Roel, on the issue of strategy, it ought to be that the executives bring a formulated strategy to the board for its approval or not approval. Quite a number of people that we talked to said, no, it's the other way around. The board, the chairman and the board formulate the strategy and present it to management for its application. I wonder what you guys think about that. Where does the initiative for the strategy originate? You remember that, Gavin?
Yes, indeed. And I think we've got a number of panel members eager to respond to that one. So Roy, you put your hand up, so I'm going to acknowledge that formal courtesy, as it were.
I think, with due respect, both those two options are wrong, Johan. What I find works best is that if there's a session early in the piece between management and the board, where the strategic options are spelled out, and let me go back one step. What's very important today, because we live in a very complex world, and we live in a very complex country, that the risks are first of all clearly identified. And that there then is a dialogue between management and the board on the strategic options. And the board starts to express a view, but not a final view. Then I'm just talking about my preference. Then management goes away and develops a strategy, possibly with some outside input. And then they come back and there's another session between management and the board.
Yes.
The board then says, okay, these are our views. We like what you've said there. Do you want to rethink this one? And then management goes away. And then at the third iteration, there's a sign off by the board where they say, we buy into the strategy. Of course, at that stage, you would hope there'll be some financial numbers attached to it, and particularly what the capital, human capital and financial capital implications are. And of course, these days, the board must understand the sustainability implications and what you are doing to the environment by adopting that strategy. So if three-phase, early discussion, progress, and then a final agreement. That's my view, but I guess there are other ways of doing it.
Rose seems to be agreeing with you. Rose?
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, that was what I tried to state right at the beginning, that the board gets involved in the development of the strategy, but that is the role of the executives. And they are the ones who will actually come up with a grand design at the end of it all to be discussed with the board, and the board gives the approval. And following that, the board does not sit back. The board ensures the implementation of that strategy. They monitor progress with regards to the implementation of that strategy. But I'm hearing it for the first time that there can be a board that can actually develop a strategy and impose it on the management. If they do that, management will actually have the right to say, but I mean, this is not our strategy, it's yours. Yeah. Implement it, let's see how well you will succeed in that. Even if they don't use the words. Behaviorally, that will be, it's got to be developed and owned by the executives with the involvement and comments and reflections by the board. It belongs to the executives. If there's any company anywhere in the world where the board actually goes on a retreat of their own and come with some strategy and impose it on executives. I mean, I'm hearing this for the first time.
Is our very governance structure impeding the ability of chairmen to get the most out of their boards? Because the very infrastructure is not necessarily optimal, is the question I'm posing here.
Yeah.
But where the chairman is concerned, I think that's one of the key responsibilities of a chairperson, to manage the dynamics. I've just emerged from being chairman of a board that actually fielded people from organized labor in large numbers. You have to keep reminding them of their fiduciary responsibility. The boards may even be inhabited by all manner of prima donnas who in certain instances, behave like wild cats. So your responsibility as a director it's like heading wild cats. So those are some of the challenges, in particular with state-owned enterprises, or where the state has a role to play, because they bring people who are not necessarily well qualified to be on the board and don't fully understand their fiduciary responsibilities. So there is a sense in which, when we said we're going to talk about the challenges facing current board chairmen, that's one of them. Heading these wild cats, dealing with the prima donnas, and dealing with the kinds of people that come to the board essentially to hold down a seat, hold down a job because there is a fee to be earned. So you have to manage those as well. So those that actually come to the board and they have very little to say. So, I mean, when one way to deal with those, tell them right at the beginning, even as you introduce yourself as this chairman, that I shall pounce on anybody at any time. Let us actually have that kind of accord. So if you're not prepared, and people don't want to be embarrassed, so I'm not going to entertain only the too talkative. Even the quiet ones, I will actually beg you to make a contribution.
Yes.
And I tell you, it makes a big difference. People prepare, people behave.